Oh, an official announcement.
Peter, official announcement. We're being recorded. Peter Lorge, how are you doing?
Oh, pretty well, pretty well.
So today I'm talking to Professor Peter Lorge, who is a very famous historian of specifically Chinese and specifically martial culture. And he's been hugely influential in the field of martial arts studies, especially still for the book Chinese Martial Arts from Antiquity Until the 21st Century. Is that the title?
I think so. I'd have to go look the books up in the office. This is our guest room.
Yeah. So there's the screen. Yeah, Chinese Martial Arts. So there's your website and the history department of Vanderbilt University. And you're in Nashville. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah.
So what got you into martial art?
Actually, I was scrawny, book reading teenager when I was growing up in Brooklyn, which is sort of a bad place to be a scrawny book reading nerd. So, and I was growing up. I'm born in 1967, so I was very aware of the Japanese martial arts, much more than the Chinese stuff.
Okay.
And then we all had Shogun.
Yes.
So we all got into Japanese stuff at that time. And so, I think now I'd be one of those people who's just on the internet watching and reading all the stuff that you can get now, which we couldn't get when I was growing up, which you couldn't get.
Yeah.
And between military stuff and martial arts and being fascinated with Chinese characters and all that, so got to go train. And, I started for self-defense. So I started in this very self-defense oriented, practical school on Avenue U in Brooklyn under Sensei Lou Neglia. And it was, full contact kickboxing and street fighting, pragmatic stuff. And that was the awesome thing to have for me at that age. That was exactly what I needed as a 15, 16-year-old right in there. And, I was taking the subway. And New York subway was a little scarier back then.
Yeah.
And so it was fantastic for me. It was everything I wanted. It was confronting all of my fears and getting over them, and at least having a veneer of toughness that I could maybe call on with something to back it up. Never got into a fight, a real one, but.
And then which came first? The interest in, were you a historian first, or a scholar of Chinese culture first, or was it Chinese first, or what was the sequence there?
It's hard when you're at this stage in your career because you think that you were always, it's kind of destiny, right? You're going to do this. It's hard to say. It's looking back now, I wouldn't change the path.
Mm-hmm.
But I also realized that any change, there were a lot of places that could have gone other directions. I could have ended up doing modern China at a lot of points.
Okay.
Where I just happened to run into the people who were doing modern Chinese history were not that great, or not that great to me. And I don't want to indict anyone. I could easily see why someone wouldn't want to be nice to me. But also, I did a lot of literature. And my master's degree is actually in European medieval studies.
Okay.
So I did a field in Anglo-Saxon, and I worked on, European medieval texts, and I've had, medieval Latin and all of that stuff. Yeah, I could have gone any number of directions. It just sort of worked out this way. And the China stuff, I feel like I'm now broadening out again.
Yeah.
Because, in the academic world, you have to narrow down to do that dissertation. And I narrowed a lot of what I was doing as I was coming up for tenure recently, because you can't say to your colleagues for some reason, well, I do these 3 or 4 things.
Yeah.
You have to say, I do this one thing.
Yes.
And then after you've done that and you've gotten tenure, then you could say, okay, now, so right now I'm doing stuff on tea. And that would have confused people.
Okay.
So, okay, military, okay. And even martial arts I'd kind of downplayed,
Ah,
and technology. And now that I'm past that, now suddenly I can go back to that. So yeah,
mhm.
I don't know. There's so much cool stuff in China that's untouched,
Yeah.
and there's so much stuff. I mean, it's mind-boggling. So I need a lot of lifetimes and a lot better brain to go through it all that I'm interested in.
So you've worked a lot on, and you get really into the things that really into your subjects. I mean, you could just talk and talk and talk about them all. So, but the first time we met, you were talking a lot about gunpowder,
Yeah,
a lot, and then the next time we met, you were talking about tea.
yeah.
Um, and so, is it the case that you just that you want to know everything about the development of gunpowder, or is it what is the driving interest?
That's the great thing about being in the position I'm in, which is that I can be completely obsessed and focused on something because I'm interested in it.
Hmm.
And so gunpowder stuff, I recently connected with someone who knows someone who has the facilities for us to reproduce 11th century gunpowder recipes and test them.
Hmm.
And I've been waiting for that for a long time. Now it just so happens that his part of his day job is he's a infectious disease specialist for the U.S. Army. So he's been kind of busy lately, and we've gotten a little off track on that. But that's going to be a fantastic, real project. Tea, yesterday I was translating a 8th century text on tea,
Okay.
which I'm doing for fun. Uh, but it'll be a book at some point. I'm going to do a bunch of translations of tea texts, and I've been teaching. We just finished our semester, and I've been teaching a global history of tea class.
Okay.
So eventually, that'll be 2-3 years. That'll probably be a book.
Yeah.
And yes, there's so much, and gunpowder. All of it. I don't. I've got a 1290 Syrian text on gunpowder recipes.
Hmm.
And so tracking the transmission of the recipes and how you make saltpeter across Eurasia in the 13th century seems kind of interesting.
Hmm.
There's just so much, and we have the documents, and because now we can do computer searches.
Hmm.
So I can search thousands of Chinese texts in, a fraction of a second for keywords
Hmm.
and find all sorts of stuff that you couldn't do 20 years ago.
Hmm.
So I get to do what I want, which
So,
is exciting.
so yeah, that's that's quite a good position to be in. I guess as long as you're in a history department, you're teaching history, then you can teach
Yeah.
the history of more or less whatever, and it makes sense. I was once asked, because I work in a media communication cultural studies department, and I was asked to offer courses on my research interests, and a course needs to have at least like 10 students on it. The assumption would be 20 to 50 maybe.
Yeah.
And I offered a course in martial arts and media culture, and a grand total of 2 people signed up. So I had a kind of mini sabbatical that semester. So it's very hard for me to kind of articulate my research interests to the concerns of the student body. But
Yeah.
I remember you saying that you often teach film as well. Is that right? So you
I
make
used
history,
to.
but you incorporate film into that.
So I just finished a course, such as it is to finish a course. We sort of had class for 8 weeks, and then the last 6 weeks was blown up.
Yeah.
I teach a class on From the Cultural Revolution to Tiananmen,
Mhm.
which is, short of a Holocaust class, one of the most depressing classes you can possibly teach.
Mhm.
And we watch Farewell My Concubine, Bawang Bieger, and To Live, Woja. But they also go and we see Yingxiong, a hero, with Jet Li
Mhm.
at the end. We didn't see that in this class because we got cut short, so we
Mhm.
couldn't do the film discussion.
Mhm.
And then they also watch the documentary Gate of Heavenly Peace.
Mhm.
I was going to go back to doing film. I was actually not going to teach that class. I was going to substitute a film-based class on film and nationalism in China.
Okay.
But I just got too busy doing other things and I couldn't do the class prep.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, what's really cool, if anybody cares, is on YouTube now there is a channel you can watch old Chinese movies, and they've finally subtitled them from the 20s and 30s. And I used to teach some of those movies, and I would have to give the students sort of a rough outline because there were no subtitles.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is what they're saying in this scene. And that was rough at the beginning of a class because the students don't expect to have to discuss a movie they can't actually understand fully what's going on. Yeah. But now now it's been subtitled. So I may go back to teaching film. In this next year is already fixed. I'm going to teach my usual surveys in the fall. In the spring, I'll be teaching Chinese economic history, but I'll also be teaching a seminar, which we'll see if I get my 5 students, on translating Sun Art of War.
Oh, yes.
So we're going to sit down with it in classical Chinese, and it's going to be partly about reading classical Chinese, partly about reading military text, and partly about translation, because that's what I'm working on a lot of these days. And so, but maybe when I get back, I'm supposed to go to Shanghai the following year for a year. And then maybe when I get back, I'll do a new film class. I'd like to get back to the film class because it'll connect to what I think will be a book on martial arts in the modern, bring my stuff more modern. And you have to bring film into it because it's this construction of martial arts in films that seems so central to our concept of what it is now. And it's that, Ben Judkins had that good, I think he was the one who made the point, maybe it was Matt Pauly, about how all the martial arts stunt guys in Hong Kong were coming out of a Hongga background. And that's one of the reasons why Huang Fei Hong was so important, is because they were looking back to their lineage. And then there's the other 6 of the big 7 martial arts in China. And that's all a modern construction too. So, it's sort of, it's constructed and it's reinstantiated by the movies. And then all these movies become about nationalism. And, there's there's a lot in there. And you had, what's her name, Gina Marchetti.
Yeah.
And she did that recent book, Citing China, which was very interesting.
Yeah.
So there's also a lot more books on film than 20 years ago when you couldn't get the films and there weren't that many books on them.
Yeah.
And now there's a lot of films are available. You can get the books on them. So I'm probably about 10, 12 books behind and maybe 30 movies, but you can catch up.
So what are your, I guess you've got some people doing a degree in history, or they're minoring in history, or they're taking an option in history. And then they walk into your class and you start watching films, hugely fictionalized, sensationalized action films with martial arts in. How do you treat the text, and how do you position that in relation to history?
Well, so that's where the big difference comes in, because one of the things I noticed in film studies, and I always said when I used to go to the film studies, our film studies program just became a department. So that's great for film studies. It means I'm a little less important in that sense because I'm not in that department. We have departments and programs. And so now when the programs become departments, then they're much more formal structures. So you can take it from that literature perspective, or you can take the pure film perspective, or you can take the historian's perspective. And I tend to do a mush of the 3, which is to say, okay, here I am I'm a historian, so I want to know the background. So one of the reasons why I did the martial arts history book first was because my perspective is I want to know what is in, we all raise our hands and swear our oath to postmodern theory, and we understand the limitations of our texts. So, but what is, and then we sort of look at the movies and say, okay, so where is the fiction departing from? Or what do these guys think they understand about the past that they're putting in these movies? And so that's part of my thing. And then you go into the sheer just, okay, here's the shot, here's the camera angle. And then I just generally feel inadequate when I do those classes because, I'm just not, I don't feel terribly good at it, if that makes sense. Okay. So that was one of the reasons I wasn't totally sad to give it up. I thought I was not doing a good job. Mm. I don't know, the students I can read, and then of course being a good academic, I can discount any positive evaluations and, focus on the bad ones or that's the one student hated me. Oh my God, it's the end of the world. And so maybe if I can build my confidence back up to teach the class. Mm-hmm. But it's hard to deal with it because Chinese film has changed so much in the last 20 years in real terms. And then on top of that, the access to movies that we do now have that we just didn't have. Mm-hmm. And then there's the movies, by the way, we're still not seeing. There were apparently dozens and dozens of movies made during the Cultural Revolution, some of them criticizing the Cultural Revolution, which were never distributed. Mm-hmm. And so then when you try to talk about film history, you kind of, we're not seeing the real film history. Mm-hmm. There's a whole chunk of it that's missing. And then there's the problem of the audience, which is the other challenge I find in this, which is what movies do Chinese people see? Mm-hmm. Getting at some sort of data on that. So then you end up in this very abstract sense of here's this movie just as an artifact or an art object, which gets around a lot of the theoretical problems, but then I find unsatisfying because, inevitably a student will logically ask, well, so what do Chinese people think of this? And you can't even say, well, the box office was this much. So, so my inclination now is to relate it back to Chinese literature. And so to tie things like Shui Hu Zhuan, Outlaws of the Marsh, or the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, and that tradition, and then try to see how that's reproduced in the movies and then show a continuity. Mm-hmm. But it's the discontinuities that are hard to show without, well, maybe if I go read those other 10 or 12 books that I'm still behind on, that'll solve it for me. Someone else may have solved that, I hope.
Yeah, I mean, in a kind of British cultural studies tradition, what you would, in the tradition of people like Stuart Hall and the Birmingham School of Cultural Studies, which were the ones that really sort of made it famous in Anglophone world, you would try and construct what Stuart Hall called a conjunctural analysis, which is you can know that there were some films that were censored and that maybe weren't seen, or maybe they were seen by some people and then all of a sudden they were clamped down upon or whatever. But you have to try and kind of plot the energies, don't you? You have to kind of look at the way that people are politicized and you have to try and track the kind of discursive energies, don't you? And the kind of, or like in the Foucault sense, the Foucauldian sense of like, what would be the discursive statements that were being said in different ways at different times. It's hard to do like an empirical, like, 10,000 people saw it and 5,000 liked it and 2,500 didn't like it. And you can't do that kind of stuff, can you?
Yeah. And that's, the thing that got me was we had it must have been like almost 20 years ago. We actually had some Chinese filmmakers come through. And there was a guy who was promoting these Chinese movies that had not been seen. And what I found fascinating was there was martial arts stuff showing up in these mainland movies. Mm-hmm. And I could see the affiliation from the Hong Kong movies. So these guys had seen some of that stuff. Yeah. And they hadn't seen these early Chinese movies, these ones I mentioned from the 20s and 30s. So at that point, I'm kind of, I'm looking for that. Can I track your influences? And then visually, yes. And I'm fortunate that because my wife's an art historian, so she looks at stuff in ways that I can't even conceive of, and then she'll see something and then say, there it is, and I'm like, oh, okay, yeah. And I just, and so when we read martial arts, where we sort of say, like right now, when you look at someone like Donnie Yen, and suddenly he starts bringing in BJJ moves and MMA stuff, and why? Well, he's an actor, he's looking for something new, he's doing different things. But suddenly you can see a very visible change in the martial arts practice. And that we can do. But yeah, this what do you want to say, energy or whatever is what are they trying to do? And I think that the problem with the Chinese stuff, as opposed to the Hong Kong stuff, is that they do have a film archive. You can access it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's there. So now I don't want to touch it because I know that there is something which could be accessed, which I'm not accessing. And I don't want to talk about something that someone could just kind of, it's sort of it's the, why don't you look it up on Google? People are sitting there with their phone. Is this the case or not? And someone says, well, you can just pull your phone out of your pocket and check. Well, if there's a film archive where it can be checked, I don't want to speculate.
Yeah.
But it puts a limit on what I can do. So I don't think I'd ever write a book on film, although I had dreams of that at one point.
Did you? Well, yeah. I mean, that would be an interesting book. But I wanted to ask about the relationship between your practice and your academic interests. So you wrote the book about Chinese martial arts.
Yeah.
Were you practicing then? I know that I think you do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu now. I mean,
yeah.
Is there a relation, or is it just not necessary?
Yeah, the funny thing is in America, it was and is very hard to get access to traditional Chinese martial arts. And that has remained true forever and ever. And I don't know why it didn't catch on in a certain sense. I think when I was younger, I would have wanted to do it. I did some Taiji sword when I was in Beijing. I've done, I did Chinese wrestling when I was an undergraduate. And that was a big shock because one of the things when I started as a teenager, I realized, okay, we're fighting. Okay, this is great, full contact. And that was a school you would, throw people on the ground. And there were moves to get off the ground. And so it was very pragmatic. But then, even then I was aware, so what happens if you end up in one of those guys rolling around on the ground thing?
Yeah.
And I knew that I knew nothing.
Yeah.
And what do you do with that? And even the Chinese wrestling I was taking was mostly about throwing guys on the ground. It wasn't, and then when you're on the ground.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and then Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu hit. Yeah. And that's, as you have now found, I hear, it's an addiction. And we're all like hanging out, it was almost like you expect us hanging out on street corners, shaking, man, you wanna roll? And it's driving me crazy.
Yeah.
Because
how are you dealing with it? I mean, how are you what's your coping strategy for not being able to roll?
Hey, there's only so many videos of the ADCC tournaments, you're watching this going, oh, and I had a dream yesterday. I was waking up, I was actually trying to get into my stuff so we were going to roll. And I was like I was pulling stuff out of my bag, trying to, change for class. Yeah. And it, for some reason, as a frustrating dream where you just can't seem to, get your gi out of your bag and I woke up thinking, oh, geez, so hopefully we'll be clear in another month to roll.
Yeah. I had I'm a beginner, like an absolute beginner with BJJ, but not with like hitting and punching and hitting people with sticks type martial arts. But I was unable to cope. I had to pretend that it had never happened. It was too depressing to think about. Trying to like convert yoga stuff into BJJ mobility kind of. But then I just thought, no, I'm gonna make a dummy. So I constructed a dummy at the weekend out of an old punching mannequin.
Yeah.
And tied some, and I was really pleased because I articulated the arms with nunchakus in the middle and then towels and things. So it's got articulated arms. And I built it and I tied it I put a gi on it and a belt. Yeah. And went out in the garden. I was just transitioning, and all of a sudden I've realized that I can progress, because for me at this early stage, it's like I know how to do an arm bar, and I know how to do a rear naked choke, and I know side control, and I know, but how do you transition between these So I've just ordered a dummy online, a proper one, because for me, I can learn transitions on a very compliant uke. There is no more compliant an uke than a stuffed dummy, right?
Well, I always feel like as a senior belt, one is often being a more than compliant uke
Yeah.
For someone, because they're sort of doing something and you're kind of pushing them, like, no, you know, so they start doing something and you kind of like push them, like, you know, you
Throw yourself.
Yeah, no, I've done that.
Put the choke on yourself. Yeah.
Like, no, you need to, like, here, move your, you know, and it's frustrating when you're trying to. I only recently started teaching at Vanderbilt because some students asked me if I'd come in and coach their BJJ.
Yeah.
And it was very weird to do that with students, with Vanderbilt students, because then, you know, you're like, okay, no, here. And I was actually having them one point, like, no, okay, here I taught rear naked choke. Okay, let's do that. And I'm sort of sitting there while they're trying to do it.
Yeah.
And they're like, okay, yeah, no. And they're like, I'm like, look, if I'm still talking,
yeah, it's not on. Yeah.
You know, and it's such a weird art in that sense that you're like, I'm going to coach you on how to get me to the point where I have to tap. And sit there very calmly, like, okay, yeah. Oh, that's good. Yeah, okay. Yeah. And yeah, it's driving me crazy. It's definitely that addiction that, you know, I said we're going to go to Shanghai next year. We're supposed to, if things still do that.
Yeah.
And when my wife was asking, you know, some people asked us, would we go? And so the first thing I did is, you know, BJJ schools in Shanghai, you know. And a few years ago, someone was trying to get us to go to Berlin.
Yeah.
And I said to my wife knew that I was serious about the possibility, because I said, okay, we could go. There are 3, you know, it looks like there are 3 good BJJ schools in Berlin.
Well, we have to be located in this exact area.
Well, we should be near one of them, you know.
Yeah. No, everyone does that now. It's a thing, isn't it? Where you go, where do you want to go on holiday? Should we go there? Well, yeah, that's fine. Let's go there.
I try not to be that much of an addict where I'm like, I can be, you know, because we do these academic trips and although I have to say, when that lovely conference at Chapman last year.
Yeah.
And I only realized after we got there that there were actually some people who had, you know, they were BJJ people and they had their gis. What was her name? She was from Greece, but she was teaching in Finland or something.
Anna.
Yeah, and it was like, and she's like, oh well, because she was going to compete in the Long Beach, and I felt so stupid for not bringing a gi with me.
Yeah.
Because, or even no gi stuff with me. It's like, well, they have a mat room, but you wouldn't have got me back to the conference.
We weren't allowed in anyway. The university went all insurance and liability, and Andrea tried to make it happen. And I mean, I brought some gloves. I didn't bring much else. I just thought, but yeah, there was all sorts of things. But the university just went, no, we can't do that. But yeah, Anna Kavura. I mean, she's hopefully gonna come on this podcast soon. She's an incredibly high level competitor, and yeah, she's cool. But I wanted to ask you, this is relevant to getting us back to some academic stuff as well, because you once published an article which I was going to check it again before we started speaking to each other, but I was having some terrible internet problems. So the title was something like The Difference Between Doing Martial Arts Studies and what was that again? That was in the International Journal of the History of Sport, but the title was A Distinction Between Studying Martial Arts and Doing Martial Arts. Was it something like that?
Yeah, I was studying it versus practicing it.
Yeah.
Was that the paper I gave in Korea?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a fun.
That was. We could talk about that.
I'm sure he's going to be like dancing with that guy.
That was so we'll talk about the conference first. So you were a keynote and you were doing a lecture to like a packed theater full of people, but like 99% of them had just been bussed in from local colleges and schools, and most of them were asleep. most of the people in the audience were just asleep. And you talked about it after, said, funny thing about like Asia, where it's more polite to turn up and go to sleep than it is to not turn up at all. I've never seen someone try to engage with an audience as much as you did, and no one was listening. It was like, it was me, I was there, I was the audience.
I felt sorry for those kids because I know that they sort of said, look, you're going to this thing, and they showed up. And it was such a big room too.
Yeah.
You know, the better experience I had with that, I gave a talk on Sun Art of War, you know, Chinese strategy, to the Air War College and then to one of the Air Command and Staff. I can't remember which one of them. And one was 250 people and the other was 500.
Yeah.
And apparently, it's like a movie theater, it almost looks like. At one of them, someone told me a couple of years later, the commander was in the booth and he was looking down at the audience members, and he knew everyone had assigned seating, so he knew who wasn't paying attention to the talk.
Yeah.
And he called them all out afterward and just tore into them. And I was like, wow, can I do that again? You know, some guy who's actually looking, you didn't pay attention. You didn't pay attention.
Have a button.
Yeah, but zapped. So that was a very strange. I had a lot of fun in Korea with that, but it was a very strange experience.
Yeah.
So what were we talking about? We were talking about that article.
The actual article that was published subsequently.
Yeah. Yeah, something like that. I can't remember even what I said. I've lost track of things.
Okay.
I think I'm not sure whether it's age. It's not getting hit in the head. I haven't been hit in the head for a long time.
Yeah.
That's one of the reasons I actually stopped doing some of the striking stuff is,
yes.
I usually practice before I go to class.
Yeah.
So you can't get punched in the face and then 2 hours later give a lecture class because you'll be sort of like, and
I struggle with the lunchtime BJJ sessions in Cardiff because I find that afterwards, even if you've had a shower and everything, you've had some food, you just kind of like, you just want
to. I have to do that. Otherwise I have too much. If I don't do that before I go to class, and I usually, when I'm teaching Tuesday, Thursday, I've usually been to the gym. You know, I've lifted, I've gone to BJJ, had lunch, come back, go into class, and then I'm calm enough in class, and not just like, on the students. And if I haven't done that, I'm just like way too aggressive in my lecturing.
Really? Is that in
I need to be more relaxed.
No, I can't train before class, but are you working on anything? Are you researching anything martial artsy at the moment, or is it kind of just tea and gunpowder now, or?
God, it's everything. It's always everything with me. That's why. So I actually just read a fabulous dissertation by this young man, Israel Kanner. I think he's about to defend on martial arts in the Ming Dynasty. He's making a very important argument, which has actually now changed. That talk I gave a couple of years ago in Cardiff, locating the shift to unarmed combat in sort of modernity. Yeah. He makes a very good argument that it actually comes out of the 1560 Jishao Xinshu, General Qi Ji Guang's training manual. Mm-hmm. And he makes an argument that even though Qi Ji Guang drops the unarmed combat section in the subsequent version, 24 years later, 24, 26, something like that. See, I try to forget those things. I wrote an article on that, so I can. Yeah. If someone calls me and I say, "Well, I wrote something." Yeah. But he makes an argument that from then on there is a tradition of writing about unarmed combat, and that it starts in 1560, and that it comes out of that manual. Mm-hmm. And that's consistent with a lot of other stuff going on in the Ming Dynasty. I have an article coming out at some point. It's part of a group of articles on religions and violence, that I did an article on the worship in the military temple. So the military temple, the martial temple, the Wu Miao, and the generals' worship there changes over time, partly because they get new military exemplars, martial exemplars, But partially, I would argue that so Guandi, the the great, or Guan Yu, the hero of Samguo of the Three Kingdoms, he's taken out of the temple as not a martial exemplar, and then he comes back in after the novel, The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, becomes popular in the Ming Dynasty. So I think you have a situation where the literary tradition starts to influence the concept of what martial exemplars are.
Okay.
So when you put all that stuff together, you realize that there's something going on in the Ming Dynasty where there's a changing concept of what it is to be a martial exemplar.
Okay.
And partly that's coming out of the literary tradition. And then there are these arguments. And so that's the interesting thing, is there are actually debates by court officials who are saying, well, since you have a fixed number of martial exemplars, you have 72, because that matches the 72 disciples of Master Kong, of Confucius. Mm-hmm. So the problem is you get new martial exemplars. So if you have to add someone, you have to take someone out. So they actually have debates about, well, this guy really isn't a martial exemplar, or this guy's a better martial exemplar than that guy. Mm-hmm. At the same time, that very tedious article I wrote in your martial arts studies reader that has all the bibliographical, I couldn't believe you let me put those lists in.
Not tedious, you can't say things. That great chapter that you got.
The reader is wonderful. My article, which has put you right down. But if you look at the change in the books that are showing up in the imperial bibliography, mm-hmm. and you look at the change in who is a martial exemplar in the martial temple, and so these are kind of significant changes. So I think now I would push back these issues of unarmed, what the meaning and use of unarmed combat is, back from sort of a reaction to modernity, a reaction to the West, okay. to an earlier time. And that was too facile, perhaps, what I said when I gave that talk. In the same way in Japan, that martial arts is really massively influenced by this closing down of the country, where it's not so much the Tokugawa regime closing off in whatever 1600. It's you take all these warriors and you say, okay, you're not fighting wars anymore. Mm-hmm. So suddenly they develop martial arts again, and the sword becomes this big fetish, because mm-hmm. the sword wasn't a big deal at that point. It was actually on the decline because it wasn't really useful in combat. Mm-hmm. They'd gone over to guns. Mm-hmm. But then they have 250 years of a bunch of guys who are supposed to be warriors who don't have to go fight in wars. So suddenly you're fighting duels, and then you're creating martial arts schools. But most if you want a wonderful movie, Twilight Samurai.
Oh yeah.
It's fantastic.
Yes, it's a fantastic film. Yeah.
But the funny thing about that is they're sort of saying, and this is whatever middle of the 19th century. This is a Meiji Restoration about to come in, and they're saying, "Wow, this guy's an expert swordsman. Wow, that's like a weird thing."
Yeah. And
so they've gone away, so that the martial arts that comes out of that it's a very different martial art. And then we get this, so I think there's a more complicated story, which is more attractive to me. And after reading Israel's dissertation, it's everything I can do. He has to have a chance to publish his work. Mm-hmm. I feel very fortunate to have, I read it and I was about to start writing an article as I'm reading his dissertation, like, oh, I'll start, he hasn't even defended yet, I don't think, and gotten his PhD. Mm-hmm. But so I will do something on that. Right now, I'm working on a book that's essentially, it's about Sun Art of War.
Yes.
In how it's been received in the West.
Okay.
And so it'll piss off a lot of people, probably, as many of my things do. Yeah. Which is to say, this notion that Sun Tzu is about indirect fighting and all that. That's not Sun Tzu, really. That's B.H. Littleheart.
Okay.
Who, for most people who don't know, and it's kind of ironic, he was the preeminent strategist, certainly British strategist, in the 20th century. Mm-hmm. And he wrote this book called Indirect Strategy, or Strategy, the Indirect Approach. Mm-hmm. And he writes the preface to Samuel Griffith's translation of Swinze, which comes out in 1963.
Yeah.
He writes the foreword, in which he says, "Oh, this is great. It just proves that my theories of the indirect strategy are true because the Chinese have been doing it for 2,500 years."
Yeah.
So I will finish that book, I hope, this summer.
Yeah.
And I'm on the easy part. I did all the hard part already. I was in England last year and before that doing research trips because their correspondence are available. Mm-hmm. And so you can just read them talking about things and you can see this translation. And in the Chinese context, there isn't a discussion of indirect strategy. It just doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. So we have all these Westerners, and it comes up, I'll get martial artists, and they start talking about, well, the Chinese are like this, and their strategy is like this, and you're sort of like, no, it's not. Okay. If that concept works for you, that's great, but that's not how they're reading it. Their military doesn't read those texts those ways. I gave some talks, I said to the military and some people, and I said, if you read it this way and it helps your strategy, helps your strategic thinking, fantastic. Mm-hmm. But if you're reading it to try to understand what the Chinese military thinks, that's not what they're saying. And if you want to know what they think, you can read it. I mean, I'm not reading secret documents. They publish stuff. Yeah. And so, so that's what I'm working on now. I'll leave out the other series of projects, which on music in the 11th century and okay. And huge translation project that I've been trying to launch for a while that may actually come off the ground and occupy me to the rest of my end of my life, and it still won't be done. Okay. But yeah, there's all this really cool stuff. Yeah. So I'm still translating the wrestling manual from the 10th century. Yeah. I don't know when it'll be done.
Okay. Okay. I when I bought my copies of The Art of War and also the Book of Five Rings, and I was buying all these different books at the same sort of time. Before I started writing about martial arts, and I was trying to work out how I could or would become a scholar of them, because I'm not a trained historian, I'm not a sociologist. There's so many things that I knew I couldn't do, so I was trying to work out where I fitted into this world. And I remember reading on the back covers of these books, the one that stands out is the Book of Five Rings. And it was about business people in the 20th century will really appreciate it. And when you said the receptions of these books, these Chinese and Japanese texts, in the modern Anglophone West, and they've become translated as business manuals somehow. It's crazy. Yeah.
Well, I went to a conference, they actually had it at Vanderbilt a few years ago, really nice people, on Swinze, and they held it in the business school. Yeah. And
you gate crashed it.
The weird thing is, I listen to this stuff, and people are doing, in some cases, wonderful things. I mean, just making the world a better place stuff, not just the business, but people who were doing this was the way of peace. They were doing this, bringing it to schools in poor neighborhoods and convincing children to not fight, giving them the mental pathways to sort of not get into a fight. And I thought, wow, this is fantastic. But I got to the end, so I was the final speaker, which is I'm not sure whether it was good or bad, because I kind of went in and said, what you guys are doing is fantastic, but it's not Swinze. And the issues that, because everyone takes this military text and says, well, somehow it's not a military text.
Yeah.
And it's about not fighting. And you're like, well, that's not reading, that's not what the text says. Yeah. The text says, okay, I mean, it's kind of like when we do martial arts, right? Which is, we're supposed to be practicing this stuff, not because we want to go beat up people. And I hope I never have to actually do anything. When I was younger, on some one level, you're like, oh, I want someone to, I don't want to fight, but it wouldn't be cool if someone tried and, okay, awesome. And even better if there were some women around to watch and go, wow, what a great guy you are, and then you get to a certain age and you think, God, it would be really horrible, even if it all worked out perfectly, if someone actually tried to hurt you or hurt someone and you actually have to do something, you'd probably be traumatized for, if you were lucky, only a few months, if not years. And so these guys are not talking about, they're saying, yeah, strategy is the least good way to get what you want or to get to an advantage is through fighting. Mm-hmm. That's the least good way. Now, given that you're reading this book, now we're going to fight. So it's sort of like, it'd be like going into the martial arts school and saying, well, if the best thing to do is not to fight, well, okay, ready, we shake, we fist bump, and I run out the door,
There's a brilliant article by a guy called Neil Gong, and it's called How to Fight with No Rules, or How to Fight Without Rules, and it's about, he does some field work like with the Dog Brothers, so he's training with the Dog Brothers and talking about all these different scenarios. And it's meant to be like as real as it possibly can be. He said, and yet no one tried to talk down their opponent. No one tried to reach in the pocket for their phone to call them. Some people waited until they got really serious and pulled out fake guns and things like this. But yeah, you don't go to a Dog Brothers event to learn how to talk people down.
Well, yeah, it's and I've been watching with my daughters this Criminal Minds, which has 15 seasons, but it's my daughters are teenagers, and so I keep watching stuff in it, and I think, gosh, the writers have no idea how fighting takes place. They have no idea what the capabilities of guns are, because the heroes are always they're close to people, but they're acting like they can't hit someone who's standing behind. Or they're far away and they're like, oh, wait, I can't get a shot. You're like, of course you can't get a shot. You've got a pistol and you're 50 feet away. No one would take a shot at that range, but and they so don't care. And I suddenly realized that there's this Hollywood tradition of the the dialogue that happens with the hostage taker.
Okay.
And in order to have that take place, you have to know nothing about guns. Because there was it was like the last Dirty Harry movie. It was just, I don't know whether Clint Eastwood just needed the money or something. And there's a scene where the guy he's got a woman like this, and he's holding a knife out to the side.
Yeah. Dirty
Harry, of course, shows up with some even more huge pistol. It was not just a 44
Magnum. Yeah.
And he says, okay, why don't I just shoot you? And the guy says, well, maybe in dying, I contract and I stab, I kill her with, and you're like going, no, at that range, he shoots you, your head goes splat, it's all over. There's no, you're not going to reflexively it's not going to happen.
But if you were a samurai and you'd read the Hagakure, then yeah, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, so you see this combat, and you think, the outcome that you were required to have, you have to have this Hollywood tradition of this, let her go, no, I will, and you have a whole dialogue, and you think this is not what would happen. And everyone, and you always feel badly for these actors. They're like, point the gun. And some of them I think they must have had, some of them had some training, and they're, well, because there's this whole thing about you come out, and some of them have no clue, and they're waving these things around. I always love it when someone walks across in front of someone who's pointing a gun.
Oh my God! Oh, word.
And I flinch because
and even at an airport or something, in Brussels or something, like, whoa, please, can I go behind you?
Yeah. I was in Paris at the Musée d'Armée. And these guys came out with, automatic weapons. And I took a couple of steps back because I realized that their guns were pointing at my feet.
Yeah.
And if many years ago when I was in England doing my master's, when I actually was on pistol team at Oxford, and I was at Gatwick, or I think it was Gatwick, not Heathrow. I was having a conversation with one, they had already armed up. Mm-hmm. And I talked to one of the guys there, like, well, how often do you guys shoot? And they were like, I think there was once a month, and they did once a month of unarmed combat training.
Yeah.
And I was like, God, we shoot on the team twice a week.
Yes.
And I coached briefly Taekwondo while I was there. And we're training, a couple of days a week. And I thought, that's wrong. I'm a graduate student, and like, I'm not so sure I want, like, if you start shooting, I'm not so sure I going to feel much safer, because I don't
Yeah,
know.
yeah,
I mean, no offense to those guys,
yeah,
you're not being adequately trained.
yeah.
Same thing in America with the police now, is that most of our police, they all have guns. Very few of them really train that much, and then they have inadequate martial arts training, because we have a lot of cops in my BJJ school,
Mhm.
and you deal with these guys and you realize, but these are the group that are actually training,
Yeah,
but they'll say, yeah, most of the guys don't know how to really control someone.
yeah,
It's and it's just, we all know it's just work, right? You just have to have the training and you have to work at it. Yeah, so it's a very different perspective, I think, once you start training like that.
mm.
When you see not just the represented world. That was it. Megan Morris, that she took me to task in Cardiff,
Yes.
for saying that movies were, I think I said, they're not real or something like that.
Oh yeah, you did say something like that. Yeah.
And it said something. I offended everyone there. The Welsh people were pissed off because I had just landed and I said something. I was like happy to be in England now. And I went, oh shoot, I'm in Wales. Uh, but and I started writing something because she was right. I was just so startled. It took me a while to realize that she was talking to me, because so I usually show up at places and no one talks to me. So like, oh, I get that startled look, like sort of in Taxi Driver.
That
Yeah,
one.
yeah. Well, it's like Taxi Driver. You talking to me? You talking to me? And so I started writing this piece called like making on fighting being legible and lexible.
Okay.
Like being able to see it, but also being able to write about it. And then I put it down. It's somewhere in a book. It's somewhere in a notebook.
Yeah.
But I think what I wasn't incorporating, that's why I learned a lot out of that, was that the movies tell people how a fight's supposed to take place. This is, I forget her name's book, Real Knockouts.
Yeah. Is it McCoy? McCoy?
Uh,
Yeah. And
yeah,
she's got an Irish surname like McCoy or something like this. Yeah.
yeah, and she did two books. One is
Yeah.
Real Knockouts, Real, and one
Yeah.
Real Knockouts, Reel.
Yeah. I've
And
read them. I should remember the
yeah,
names.
they're great. And I thought, oh, except for the one on the movies had somebody who did the Hong Kong movies,
Yeah.
where they kind of went in and said, yeah, I don't know anything about China or Hong Kong, and the only movies I could access were the ones in the video store, and here goes.
Yeah.
And I thought, that's that point where you say stop, But it was this notion that there's a script,
Mm-hmm.
and you see this notion of a script. The movies give you a script about what's going to happen in a fight, and then people actually act that out in real life.
Yes.
They have this idea that this is what's going to happen, and if it works out for you, great. You guys have that wonderful duo who do, what is it, Fight Perfect?
Oh yeah. They're good, aren't they?
Yeah, they take the piss out of everyone, and it's pretty hysterical. Where and this notion of, like I always said, if I'm going to get into a confrontation, I'm going to be trying to talk people down.
Yeah.
Not just because I'm not going to get into a fight if I don't have to. I'm not an aggressor. But if someone were to like tackle me where I don't see it coming, well, then I'm going to, unless they're good at BJJ, I'm going to end up in dominant position in that scramble. Not because I'm thinking about it, but because I'm not thinking about it.
Yeah.
So it's like, you grab me, we're going to be, we're going to be on the ground, and depending on what you do, there's a high likelihood I'm on your back on the other end of this, or I'm in mount, and it's going to be over really fast. But not because if I have to think about it, no.
Yeah.
But if
you don't have to think about it, yeah.
Well, that's what you said, learning your transitions. And the funny thing is, when you're rolling as you do it, I mean, I've been doing this like 10 years now. So I got my brown belt last year, and there's a lot of stuff you just kind of, that's now natural, right? And it's only natural because you've trained it, right? You obviously go over there. Right? How could you? If you go over there,
there's nothing else. Yeah. But it's like a flinch response, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
you retrain the flinch response, and you retrain everything that happens from the flinch. Actually, I'm talking to Mario Staller in a week or two, and he trains police forces of all different kinds in Germany. He's a professor as well of this stuff. So it would be really interesting to talk to people like him, and maybe people like Rory Miller, who write about these. Maybe some Krav Maga people as well, I guess, because it's all about training the flinch response, isn't it? But yeah, anyway.
Well, and I see all these guys online talking about, I don't have any. Fortunately, I don't have the actual experience, and also there are professionals who train at the school I'm at. So you realize that the real fighters, the professional fighters, they have like another gear in their, so you can roll with them. And they're not trying to prove anything by like, oh, I beat up that middle-aged college professor. This is not like, but you realize that you don't want to push. If you try to go 100% against them, they'll be like, oh, okay, and they have that. And I'm not saying that necessarily makes them, they're going to win, but they definitely have a totally different mental, physical gear that I've never had. And when I was young, maybe I wished I had. I think at this age, I don't wish I had it, right? But again, I wish I were a scary fighter. And then you realize you're not a fighter, you're not scary, and that's a good thing. And you don't want to be that guy that someone says, I want to prove something to someone, I'm going to go attack that guy.
Yeah.
No one can do that to me.
Yeah.
Not pass. He's boring.
Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, that's one of the reasons I started Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, because I didn't want to do all of this stuff anymore. All of this, I didn't want to increase the violence in the world. So we've been talking for almost an hour. I mean, and there's all sorts of chaos. I don't know if you can hear it. Please tell me you can't hear the chaos. You can. You can't.
I can't.
No. Good. Okay, good. So I think I'm gonna say thank you, Professor Peter Lorge, and I need to get there and solve some some work-life balance issues, some family issues out there. So thank you very much, Peter. It was really lovely to talk to you.
Well, thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much.